Good morning, everyone. This is Steve McLeod from East West Associates. Thanks for joining our webinar this morning. We're going to talk about the chemical industry in Southeast Asia and talk about experiences that companies have been having, chemical companies have been having in the region, and expansion into the region. Just a little background on East West Associates. East West Associates has been in business for 16 years, providing services to manufacturers that looking for operational improvement in China, Asia, Mexico, and Central and Eastern Europe. We deal with manufacturing companies across a wide variety of industries, and East West executives come from senior management positions, including companies such as Briggs & Stratton, Bechtel, Fluor, Littelfuse, Eastman Kodak, and more. Some of the areas of service that we work on, strategic business planning. We help companies on their planning. We look at a number of manufacturing-related services such as supply chain optimization, manufacturing footprint, research services on market entry, commercial services, and quite a bit of HR and executive recruitment. Now, so just a couple of slides on background before we get into the roundtable discussion on ASEAN. Most of you are familiar with the region. ASEAN's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that formed a political and trading bloc there. There's over 600 million people with very favorable demographics, a young population, and has had experienced good growth in the last few years. It's the third largest economy in Asia, and growth rates of 5 to 6% recently, and with the demographics, we expect that to go continue sometime ahead. A little bit about the industrial base there, for those of you that are looking to sell products into the market. It's a diverse base, but depending on the level of development through the region, there are different areas of concentration, with Thailand being the most established and broad and diverse manufacturing sector, as it really started to be developed in the early 80s. Singapore for chemical and medical, and then Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam for generally high labor content industries. When we look at the chemical industry in the sector, certainly in Asia and globally, China is the big player. A huge, large percentage of GDP, manufacturing and market. ASEAN, however, in total, about 5% of GDP is tied up in the chemical industry, which is more than the US or Europe. And that is, at this point, it's very concentrated in Singapore, which is a huge petrochemical and downstream hub, and also Thailand, the area east and southeast of Bangkok has been well developed. And with growing industry in developing economies, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. When we look at the materials that are available in the region, and we've tried to highlight in the map, one area that the region is known for is natural material, and certainly that's led by palm oils and oleochemicals coming out of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, cellulose and cellulose derivatives, natural rubber, certainly, wood rosin. And then just the sugar cane on here is that we're starting to see more activity around biofuels, and these are critical feedstocks for that. Petrochemicals operations are throughout the region. Several oil and gas deposits that the refining supply chain has grown up around. Also, as a matter of national industrial policy, that see well-established petrochemicals in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and beginning in Vietnam. Basic chemicals is a source generally promoted for the fertilizer industry, and that's well developed. Starting to continue some investment still in Vietnam. Polymers, as they're primarily related in the petrochemical sector, and then a growing specialty refined chemical manufacturing base, particularly in Singapore, where it's well established, also Malaysia, Thailand, and you're starting to see some more activity near Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi in Vietnam. So that's some background on ASEAN. And to get into the panel discussion, let me introduce the panelists. We've got Richard Royce. Richard's currently consulting on technology and market trends for Asia-based chemical companies. Previously, he ran Solenis' supplying processing aids and functional chemistry to the pulp and paper industry. And he lived in Shanghai for several years in the 2010s. Tsebeng Lim in Singapore. Tsebeng began his career in the chemical industry, transferring technology and starting up major petrochemical facilities throughout Asia. He then held several technology and supply management roles in Asia with Turk and Ashland, eventually managing a network of distributors and tolling operators across the region. Yan Laishan lives in Shanghai. He's currently involved in marketing and distribution of food additives and natural ingredients. He previously was head of procurement for specialty chemical companies Evonik and Ashland and sourcing operations around the region. Matt Howells, currently director of supply chain at Acme Hardesty, a major importer and distributor of natural feedstocks from Southeast Asia. Palm oil derivatives, glycerin, castor oil, among many others. Previously, he worked with Olemic digitizing and automating supply chain processes at major chemical companies. He was also director of operations with Brenntag, a major chemical distributor. And Jay Honig, currently director of East West Associates, and previously Jay was COO of Cohen Associates, a risk management firm focused on Asia, and he was based in Shanghai for many years in that assignment. Prior to that, Jay was VP GM of Beckham Group in Asia, located in Shanghai. So that's our group today. So let's kick off the panel discussion. A number of topics that we want to cover. It asks that the participants, if you could mute your microphones unless you're talking. We're getting a fair amount of background to help the audience. So, Richard, I'd like to start it off. Really, there have been a number of articles recently in the last few years, publications, the media, about companies looking beyond moving beyond China to manufacture or source. And I know you've had some experience recently in this area, both from your time when you were living in Shanghai and more recently the work you've been doing the last few years. Can you comment on how companies are viewed the region, how they experience expanding?
Yeah, yes, I can. Thanks, Dan. You know, there are two pretty strong drivers for suppliers and primary manufacturers now to look outside China into Southeast Asia. First, it's often just about following the customers. You know, depending on the particular customer industry that you're in, many of the customers who started in Asia started in China 10, 20, even 25 years ago, but they're now building new sites outside of China, places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, even Thailand. And the cost and regulatory environment can be more favorable to them in these places, even if they pay a stiff tariff on finished goods that they ship back into China. Secondly, besides following the customers, depending on how much core technology is involved, either in manufacturing know-how or equipment or product formulation specifics, protection of trade secrets and patents can be better in places outside China. And this is probably not news to most of the folks on this call. The IP protection environment inside China has improved over the past 10 years. However, even if you win a case in a Chinese court, and I have several of these, experience with several of these, the settlements awarded are much smaller than elsewhere in the world and rarely ever include forcing a stop to the infringer's operation. That is, in Europe and in North America, the most important penalties or that you have to cease your manufacturing or cut a licensing deal if you lose the case, and not just pay a fine. And that's not the case in China typically. You just pay a fine, and the fine's never big enough to recover the damages, and whoever's got the intellectual property just continues on taking your business. So that's still a big factor. Even though the environment is better on IP in China, it's still, it's better in other places, particularly places like Singapore. And just to close up here, overall, the infrastructure and available labor force in most of these countries is much better than it was just 10 or 15 years ago. So the investments in some of the smaller countries, is just a lot more feasible.
Thanks, Richard. Jay, I know you've had some experience in the last couple of years with companies that have looked to expand beyond their China operations into Southeast Asia. How did they look at making that move, or what decision factors weighed on those moves? You're on mute, Jay.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and I think people forget that Southeast Asia was developed actually before China became a 800-pound gorilla. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, all were developed earlier on than China. So they have the infrastructure there. In addition to that, one has to look at the tax incentives and investment incentives that various companies are giving now. One particular client that we assisted about a year and a half ago, they were actually exporting from China. They had some domestic business, but primarily exporting to Southeast Asia and to Europe and the US. They wanted to expand, but they were questioning whether or not China was the right place to expand. They contracted with East West, and we did a study looking at various Southeast Asia countries. They selected Thailand and made an investment in Thailand, which was considerably larger than their expansion would have been if they were in China. There were significant investment advantages, and also the overall infrastructure to be able to design and construct the facility with a high degree of predictability, if you will, around cost and schedule and quality and so forth. So we helped them through that entire process, from selecting the country to obtaining their business licenses, site selection, and then following in through the design and procurement and construction and startup of the facility. So it was quite successful.
Okay, great, thanks. For chemical companies operating in China, I mean, it's been an abundance of riches as far as availability of feedstocks and key materials that you may need for your process, and also markets, domestic markets. Jan, I'd like you to give me your thoughts on sort of if you're looking at Southeast Asia, where to look for what particular products are they advantaged in as far as sourcing and supply, and versus China, or at least being very competitive in those arenas. Can you comment a little bit on the supply situation in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, so Southeast Asia is itself a very diverse region. You have a lot of things, Actually, I mean, so in the past, I've been looking at Indonesia, I mean, Thailand for raw material like feedstocks, and like natural things, wood power related things. But if you look at the chemical value chain, you have natural resources, you got petrochemical, you got physical chemical, you got I mean, it's commodity chemical, right? Especially chemical intermediates and the market. I think the Asian countries, I think for the moment we have really a lot of raw materials related. I mean, that's has been good, you know. I mean, so from Indonesia, from Malaysia, palm oil, from the wood pulp related derivatives, and of course, oil is big. Indonesia is making probably 800,000 barrels per day production, pretty significant, you know. I mean, so, and with the downstream, I'm not really having a lot of, I think not yet there, you know, downstream problem. Most of them still in Europe, in Japan, in China. It means that's the reason we want to move a little bit of downstream productions to these regions, you know. That's a process, of course. You know.
Okay. Matt, you've had recently, last few years, a lot of experience sourcing from Southeast Asia. Comment on logistics, infrastructure, issues around sourcing. What sort of advantages or challenges you've seen working in the region from a supply chain perspective?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, Dan. Thank you. We last year imported about 4,000 containers out of Southeast Asia into the United States, all in the oleo space. What we found over the last, especially the last year, it really exacerbated issues. And as we've talked earlier about diversity in the region, each country having its own supply chain, logistics programs, networks, road structure. When COVID hit and it forced everybody to start working from home or limit the access to the production facilities, we found the production plants stayed up and running most of the time. Operations that were in what we call the back office or the back room, where certificates of analysis were done, invoicing, billing, data, all the technical stuff went remote. And so what happened is we became disjointed or disconnected between operations, logistics, and actually the data movement. We have been forced to start digitizing all of our data, our uploading of information. We can no longer rely on systems like DHL and the mail system to get documents back and forth. Because of the diversity, we found each of the countries that we were importing from or exporting out of had their own network and process of doing things. And so we put everybody into a uniform web portal, so to speak, where everybody had to upload their data, their information, so we could keep an eye on where things were moving. As everybody is aware, the supply chain out of that region is chaotic at the time. Malaysia and Singapore in that area are basically, I always joke that they're the 42nd Street Midtown subway train system there. Everything out of China is mother shipping through that region. It's the narrow pipe or narrow part of the pipe of flow of export. So you really have to be tracking everything online. Everything has to be digital. Everything has to be loaded at the time so we can keep track and watch it, because delays are killing us. So it's just a chaotic situation right now.
Okay. Well, yeah, certainly the last year around COVID has been challenging all across business. Richard, in your field, in your area, is providing guidance and staying connected to the industry. Challenges there around staying connected to the industry and be able to advise the chemical companies you're working with in Asia?
Yeah, yeah, it's been a challenge. I mean, I'll let the others maybe share some of their experiences as well. But I mean, there's obvious things that most of us have been having to deal with the past year. We're dealing with, you know, in ways such as we're doing this morning. And you know, I probably made 4 trips or 5 trips to Asia. You know, several every year as a routine, you know, primarily for just 1 or 2 clients, but, you know, there are also trade meetings and things, and all of that is stopped, of course. And I think what we're beginning to realize now is that international travel is probably going to be shut down at least another year. You know, nobody's been anywhere in a year, and at least, you know, here in America, we don't see any way to travel for face-to-face things in Asia for another year. I mean, without just onerous quarantine and other issues. You know, we're just trying to get people vaccinated now. So we had a plan for another year of this, at least. I will say, in a couple of recent projects I've had, I've been pretty impressed with the kind of software that's available for sharing large numbers of documents securely. So if you're, say, in an M&A exercise, a due diligence exercise, you know, that's totally done. There's no such thing as, you know, the war room anymore physically.
Yeah.
And so all that's done virtually, and the software, there's several, you know, places that offer this, kind of specialty places. Software is pretty good. They're, you know, not just documents, but Q&A. So you ask a question gets posted, the answer comes back in some timely fashion. It's all recorded. You know, so those are some of the things, at least in my experience, haven't been as good as they are today. And they're only going to get better because, again, to do an M&A deal or some other kind of deal like that, where you used to have at least some face-to-face, walk around the plant kind of thing, there's not very much of that left. So the software's getting better, and you know, makes doing those kind of activities a lot more practical.
Great. Okay. And just one other area to pursue, and then we'll move on. But Sabang, you're in Singapore, and travel is still within ASEAN is still pretty limited, correct? Due to COVID. And is there any outlook for that being restricted for at least intra-regional travel?
Well, if you are traveling out of Singapore, it is possible to travel between Singapore and Indonesia, and Singapore and Philippines, provided you take a COVID test before you embark, 72 hours before, and then you have to self-quarantine when you come back. So a lot of ASEAN countries are trying to establish what we call a green lane, basically a travel bubble, but it's more for business only. Leisure travel is still out.
Okay, interesting. Let's move on to some concepts around establishing a business or operations in the region. Many companies, when they look at entering the market, first step is through distributors or agents. And I know several of you have had some experience taking that route. And maybe throw it back to Richard. You've worked with a number of distributors throughout Asia over the years. Any comments about distributor selection, management, and even as far as knowing when it's time to part ways?
Yeah, thanks. I've kind of had a change of heart in this since I actually moved out of Asia. Still been involved with you know, trying to identify partners, distributors, or agents. I think, again, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, or, you know, back kind of, you know, old tapes, if depending on the industry, it might have been at the time a safer and more reliable bet to find a larger, or at least a more established distribution house to handle some of your business in countries where, if you're entering for the first time, you might not even have a local entity. So, you know, again, a lot of these distribution outfits, even if they're fairly local, were at least established, and they handled, you know, multiple product lines, multiple countries, you know, had good solid management. You know, you could, you know, set up contracts and enforce those contracts, and, you know, that was kind of a pretty good way to get started back in those days, I think. And several that I had, I was pretty happy with all of them. But I found that recently, particularly outside the larger countries, These, Vietnam is a good example. Thailand, maybe Philippines, Myanmar, maybe even Indonesia in some cases. It's very often better to find a local individual industry person who has contacts, knowledge about what you're selling, contacts into your customer base, and establish a relationship with this individual, and that individual can be prepared to scale it up. He or she goes out and finds their own team, and they build kind of a ground thing for you. Now, of course, this is inherently a lot higher risk scenario in that your new business becomes really dependent on a single individual in some cases. However, they get it started faster. You need to know how you're going to exit one day, and exit would be probably a lot harder, but you definitely will get started better in some cases, and the rewards can be much higher. So, looking for somebody who's smaller, a little more custom tailored, and building a strong relationship with them can be a good way to start. A lot of times these individuals will want a piece of the equity in your new operation. So you won't give them majority share, but you might give them 49% or whatever. They're happy with that. As long as you have some sort of drag along clause in for if you ever sell it or whatever. But again, smaller can be better. And I probably wouldn't have said that 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, great. Now, Sabeng, I saw you nodding on a couple of points there, and I know you spent a few years managing a distributor network, or a network of distributors, perhaps throughout Asia, Southeast Asia, and the rest of Asia. Things you'd like to add or share? Or
sure. I tend to agree with what Richard just mentioned. If you're new to a country or region, I think first thing that you really need to look at are potential distributors that for the country you're looking at need to have the knowledge of the local market conditions. This can be a local distributor or a pan-Asian distributor like DKSH, IMCD, or CBC. It does not matter. What matters is the knowledge of the local market conditions and also the customer context. When you have identified a couple of distributors, the next step you really need to look into to look at their whole product base and look at what you're looking for are adjacencies, which means to say that these are products that can sell together with your product should you take up this distributor. And with that, you already have a ready pool of customers. And following that, you need to be aware of the number of active customer accounts that the potential distributor is carrying, so that you must also understand their financial strength as well as cash management. This comes under the corporate financial risk analysis, and this can be gleaned from reports from corporate financial risk company, and that's companies such as Dun & Bradstreet or its equivalent. The distributor that you're targeting will need to be able to work with you, because assuming that you're not selling commodity products, but specialty chemical products, the distributor, if they do not have the technical knowledge and are unable to upsell your products and add value, they must be willing to participate in training by your technical staff so that they have a technical know-how in order to add value to your sales. And the potential distributor also need to agree to exclusivity of your product line into a multi-year contract with sales quota. So this sales quota will put their feet to the fire so that you can work with them quarter by quarter, yearly by year, to see where and push them to meet their agreed sales quota. Many times I feel that if the market is large enough, it is very often necessary to have a distribution manager managing this, because these relationships between the distributor as well as the supplier is very critical. You will be surprised to learn when I was managing the distribution network that even though the distribution network was only 24% of the total revenue for the rest of Asia, it contributed about 40% of the gross profit. That is how profitable distribution network can be to a chemical company looking at ASEAN. That's the plan.
So you found that I guess through distributor network you could access perhaps more smaller volume customers, but generally have a much higher margin in those relationships.
That is correct. And also, many times we need to work on a long-term win-win relationship because the distributor, they have many small little customers and they have a lot of customers all over the place. That's why they are able to charge a higher price per kilogram for their products. But you need to work on a long-term win-win situation with them because you can't keep increasing your price in order to capture more of a profit margin and leave less for your distributor. That is a no-no in my view.
Sounds like you may have had some issues on that front in the past. Important to align everybody's objectives. Okay, great. So Beng, I'm going to stay with you a minute
Sure.
because another is very often companies will pursue, perhaps after pursuing distributors, start to look at self-manufacturing, total manufacturing or licensing in a new market or a region. Comment on identifying those people, qualifying, difficulties, challenges, what sort of, because I know you've had some experience managing a tolling network as well.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. For me, the number one thing to look into, there are many factors that will determine whether you can find a correct toller to toll your products. Before I dive into them, one thing to take a step back is for the person who is in charge of this project to work with your procurement person in parallel, because your procurement person will be the first one that you need to rope in to look into raw material supply and availability in the country that you're looking at, and also the cost. This can make or break the project. If that is being settled, first and foremost, I feel that you need to look into the technical competency of the technical staff on site at the toller. Next comes the regulatory compliance, the EH&S, and of course the IP protection, as well as the non-disclosure agreement. What you do not want to have is a situation where you already signed the contract, they started producing, and then you have the plant face stoppage because the plant itself is not meeting the regulatory compliance in terms of wastewater discharge or soil contamination, for example. To do this properly, you do need a very technically competent person to liaise with the potential toller and look at the process equipment and look at what they have and what you need. Many times, unless you are looking for a very simple blending or a very simple reaction chemistry, if you need an even more complicated or complex process, many times the toller themselves may not have the process that you need or the process equipment. Yeah. But the toller must be open to collaborate on new equipment, purchase, and installation. To give you an example, several years back, I was in charge of putting a tolling plant in an Asian country outside of China. The toller was run by two very smart PhD chemical engineers, and they were willing to put up the equipment. We spent, or rather they spent $250,000 of their own money. They took a loan from the bank, and they divided and put the cost of the $250,000 into the tolling, in addition to the tolling fee. You'll be surprised because the original product was made in plant in Europe and ship to that Asian country. You'll be surprised that within a year, our production volume we did for that country went from 400 metric tons to 800. And by the time the third year came around, we were running 3,000 metric tons a year. And by the time the fifth year came around, we expanded the plant and it went up to 6,000 metric tons. That's, in my view, a pretty successful tolling story. Having said that, yeah, thank you. Having said that, sorry, then go ahead.
No, please.
Having said that, you do need to look into the cost effectiveness over the short term, over the longer term effectiveness of running your own plant. Because when you're looking at a potential toller, you need to make sure that the quality control is there. And back to what I just discussed just now regarding the raw material purchasing. You need to be upfront who will manage the raw material purchase and how do you do inventory count and things like this. So you have to look at the toller as an extension of your own plant. So you need to rope them in on the sales and operational planning. So they need to be aware every month you have a meeting with them. They need to be aware of what is the moving 3 month moving forward, 3 month moving average for the production volume, and also what they can see if there is expansion in the future that they need to be aware of, so that they can plan accordingly. That's all from me then.
Okay, thank you. Richard, when you were running operations in Asia, you were running from you were based in China, but I'm sure you had quite a bit of business in ASEAN emerging markets. Were you involved in either toller, structuring tolling agreements or evaluating the whether to enter into that market via toller or other methods, distribution or self-production? You're on mute there.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. I really don't have a whole lot to add. Sabine had a pretty thorough commentary there on this whole thing. Again, I get back, other than the factors that's being highlighted about costs and bringing the toller into your management team in some level about planning and all that, besides some of those things, and obviously logistics and their understanding their capabilities so that they're not doing things that they can't really sustainably do for a long time, all of that. The couple of issues that we had, had to do with intellectual property protection. And, depending on what the product was, particularly if it was a kind of a lower tech recipe driven product where you're just blending, things together as some proprietary product. That stuff typically wasn't patented, and we didn't want to patent it because then you're given, patents mean everybody can read it. Then you have to be able to trust a legal framework to protect it. So a lot of things, a lot of the most valuable technology you have isn't patented, and now isn't patented on purpose. And so, some of these places in Southeast Asia are much better with that than other places. And Singapore was one of the best ones, because we figured, we had a much stronger case, not protecting patents, but just protecting the intellectual property, the trade secrets, so that was a big driver. And Sabine mentioned that, obviously, that's always a factor. And the cases I had, that was really a primary factor in selecting in some cases.
Great. Hey, Jan, and just to continue, another comment and then wrap this one up. You've been involved from the procurement and sourcing standpoint. You've been involved in toller selection, evaluation, qualification. From the perspective of a procurement professional, what sort of things do you look for when you identify potential?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That's a good question, actually. I mean, so when companies start looking for tollers, that means they cannot make it cost effectively in their own sites. That's one problem. Or they want to be close to customers, or they have regulatory constraints that cannot really do in all an existing facility. That usually happens. I think for this totally it's a very complex scenario. I think one key thing is really to be the teamwork is so important. I mean, it's really you got procurement guys, you got this engineer guy, you got production and sales, commercial people. Really, I often found the most important to the whole team can be really work together at synergy and share information effectively and come to the right conclusion. That's so important. I mean, of course, usually commercial people driving the project. Of course, you got process technology people as another piece of important for the tolling because to design the facility correctly and effectiveness is key. But I also realize, for this tolling, the life cycle is usually not very long. I mean, you got first period of time, 3 years, 5 years. Maybe the challenge is, after 3 or 5 years, I mean, it's probably the business lose traction and probably the technology goes to the total. I mean, for that, you got the NDA, of course, non-confidentiality agreement given in place. But I found out usually after a certain period of time, 3 or 5 years, the first in the booming business, you end up into a trap. That means continue the business or you quit the business, exit the business, but the technology probably cannot be protected effectively. I mean, I don't know, it's just some of the cases I'm wasting on. Yeah.
And that's great. And so the takeaway there is these things generally have a useful life, and at the end of it, you need to think about what your next step is. And if a project's been very successful, like being the one you talked about, then maybe a natural evolution of that is to invest and build a facility. And Jay, I was going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about project delivery in Southeast Asia, maybe compare and contrast to China versus the rest of the world. If you're looking at designing and building a facility in the specialty chemical sector, what sort of things can you expect? What things do you need to be particularly aware of or be hyper vigilant on?
Well, I think the significant difference between building in China and building in Southeast Asia is the mandatory use of design institutes that you have to use in China. That becomes somewhat problematic. Some are quite good at process plants. Others, it's a little more challenging to make sure that they're aware of the international standards that, say, an international or foreign company might require, whether it's cost issues, schedule issues, quality issues, safety issues, those types of things. But as I mentioned earlier on, Southeast Asia has been developed significantly, before China did. So for the most part, and I'll qualify it by saying that we're talking about projects that are probably less than $100 million if we're looking at fine chemicals, specialty chemicals. You're not doing $1 billion petrochemical complex somewhere in a remote site. For the most part, the in-country design and construction capabilities for these companies, for these countries, are pretty well established. Mm-hmm. The way most companies handle this is they do a feed package or a front-end engineering design, either close to their headquarters or maybe regionally with an international firm. They do a front end, maybe take it a little bit further, and then transfer that design to a in-country engineering, procurement, and construction management company, and then manage them as they proceed through the project execution. It's really important to use a domestic firm because they obviously know the licensing and the specifications and standards of design and requirements, as well as what is available materials that they can use, engineered equipment, what they need to get offshore versus what they can procure onshore. So it's really makes good sense to use a domestic firm overseen by either the owner, if they have the resources and the capabilities to put some people in country during the initial design and through construction, or hire again another firm to oversee and orchestrate the entire effort. The company that we worked with about a year and a half ago, they were sort of surprised of the level of effort that's involved in building a greenfield project. They had done some local expansions at their plant, but never a greenfield project overseas. And we had, continually encouraged them to put a small, full-time team on it, and they resisted. But they initially became overcome by the demands of all of the questions relative to design and construction and procurement and who's going to buy this and who's going to buy that. So they decided that they did need a full team, and they had a part-time functional team that would come in as required to handle various issues. So all in all, I think you're going to find it a little bit easier to build in places like obviously Singapore and Thailand, Malaysia, even Indonesia. When you get over to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, certainly Myanmar, it's a little more problematic, and you need to provide a little bit more oversight and direct control over your activities.
I guess it's safe to say, though, that one common theme is that companies frequently underestimate the amount of support and effort and guidance and technical information they need to give to a.
Absolutely. No engineering and construction company is going to make these decisions on their own. These are owner decisions, and it has to come directly from the owner, and that requires a multifunctional team to be able to provide all of the direction that these companies need.
Great. Now, Richard, I recall that you may have been involved in a company that was looking at Vietnam for in the not too distant past, and that's a little less developed. It's developing rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years, but it's still pretty much cutting edge. I was curious about any experiences that you might have had or things that you considered when you're looking at the market.
Yeah, that's, from an overall standpoint, I really don't have anything to add much to what Jay said. I agree. Vietnam is not the same as Singapore, certainly. This was the case in Vietnam is a case of follow the customer. There are a couple of industries that cannot build new plants and facilities any longer in China. And so they're having to go to places where there's available natural raw materials and where the logistics are still, doable and that sort of thing. Vietnam is a share a border, so that's fine. And so, this follow the customer in a couple of industries, I'd say starting about 10 years ago, maybe a little less, has made that a lot more doable. So our project was pretty small. It was, again, a follow the customer kind of project. We built a plant there, and it came in on time, on budget. You got to have a dedicated team kind of working with the local engineering firm you start with, but it was a pretty decent experience. And, again, I think a lot of the opportunities in Vietnam are because of regulatory issues in China, particularly in China, that make it no longer even possible, not just economically possible, but no longer possible to produce there. And so the big Chinese companies or Japanese companies, whoever it is that would normally build in China, they got to look outside. And so it's kind of made the infrastructure development, engineering development capabilities in Vietnam, I think, better. So our experience was pretty good there.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point. It's in China these days, it's the regulatory regime is difficult, but it's just difficult to find sites that are willing to accept a modest size investment. It's sort of, it seems these days they're looking for the big mega investment. And so if you're looking at something more modest, then you're likely to be more welcome in Southeast Asia. Okay. Jay, in one of your past lives, you were very involved in risk management and security services, and also due diligence practice. I was curious about if you could comment a little bit on due diligence around M&A in particular, perhaps suppliers in Southeast Asia, differences or just general guidance that you can talk to for the audience here.
Well, I could probably write a book on some of the skeletons that we've uncovered over the last 8 years or so, primarily in China, but also in Asia in general. When you talk about M&A, if you look at who leads an M&A effort, 9 times out of 10, it's the legal department, supported by the finance department. From time to time, they actually get operations people involved, which is quite unique. And our experience has been that it's everyone when they say due diligence, well, okay, that's legal and that's financial due diligence. You know, are they licensed to do what they're doing, and so forth and so on. And then HR due diligence has come along, environmental, obviously, in the chemical industry. But what people really forget is reputational due diligence. And Richard touched on it, and Jan also with respect to IP. And this is probably more relevant when you're dealing with agents, distributors, or an M&A, an acquisition in some degree. You really need to understand who the company is, who owns the company, who manages the company. Is it a family-owned business? And what is their reputation? And in general, is it, how do they conduct their business? Are they ethical? Do they have any sense of corporate governance? How do they treat suppliers? How do they treat customers? How do they handle disputes? In China, you can go hire, a bunch of peasants and have them storm your office and sit there for months on end until you cave in. Okay, and so it's really important that, number one, you do obviously the legal and the financial, but you do the reputational on the individuals and in some cases the family, depending on the type of organization that you're looking at. And then Richard also mentioned this, it's difficult nowadays to put boots on the ground and actually determine whether or not they do have a factory. Are they producing something? Or are they a broker? So it's awfully hard to do a thorough due diligence without boots on the ground and really digging into your partner, so to speak. And I can tell you hundreds of stories of either joint ventures that have gone wrong or long-term suppliers that have stolen IP or are giving kickbacks and so forth. And if you have government customers, you're facing FCPA type issues. So it pays to spend a little time to take a deep dive into your relationships in Asia and elsewhere, obviously around the world.
Thanks, Jay. I look forward to collaborating with you on that upcoming book. Okay, and I guess one final topic, one final area I wanted to cover before we finish up, and I'll throw this over to Svang, but you know, when companies are looking at going into a new geography, I've found that resources, local government support and resources provided through local governments in terms of development agencies can be a differentiator in a new company's experience. And I know you've had experience with some of the development agencies around the region. Could you talk a little bit about what they do, how they can support companies, maybe some qualitative opinions about who's solid and who's a little bit behind the times? Just general comments on that.
Sure, Dan. All the ASEAN countries that we have been talking about in this webinar, they all have their own investment boards and their own individual websites. For example, in Singapore, we have EDB, Malaysia, MIDA, and then the board of investments both in Philippines and Thailand, and in Vietnam, we have the MPI. So all these boards are tasked to bring in foreign investments into the country. If you go onto their website, you can probably get about 80 to 95% of the information you need to make a first initial assessment. For example, you will be able to get information like corporate tax rates and what kind of corporate tax breaks they can give to investors and under what conditions. For example, if you go to the board of investments in Thailand, you will quickly realize that nowadays they do not give corporate tax breaks for chemical investments unless it is what they call a green investments. That means it is good for the climate. If you are just putting in a normal blending plant or reaction chemistry plant that they deem to be not green enough, they still welcome you, but they will not give you the corporate incentive that extended to other companies that invest in Thailand. I think the main difference, the websites are usually pretty good, but the main difference is when you have queries. I have always have queries when I look into the information. So sometimes I email them, and I would think that Singapore EDB, as well as the board of investment in Thailand, they are usually very fast to respond. Whereas there's a couple of other countries which I will not name, maybe because the accountability is not as clear cut. So the email may bounce around in various agencies before it comes back to you. But ultimately, they will come back to you because they are tasked to bring in investments.
All right. And Jay, if you, in 30 seconds, I know you had some interaction with the Thai Board of Investment a couple of years ago. I'd characterize that relationship, ease of working with. Any comment on that?
Very easy to work with. They actually went the extra mile to support the client. They traveled overseas to meet with the client. The package that they put together was extremely lucrative for the client. So it was very positive, certainly in Thailand. We were quite impressed.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay, well, it is 12 o'clock on the East Coast of the United States. So that's the end of our hour. Thanks to panelists. Thank you for your time and the benefit of your experiences. And I hope that the audience here enjoyed the conversation. And certainly, you know how to connect east-west if you got any questions, or is there anything we can do for you when you look in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.